Good day everyone, this is Jerry from Rhapsody Tours. In today's video, we are going to take a look at the movies over the last 100 years featuring Titanic, and I would like to thank MediaAwareness.ca for their help in gathering this information. Researching Titanic movies reminded me a lot of the television show Law & Order. Stories ripped from the headlines. Well, this was definitely the case with the Titanic disaster. In 1912, the year Titanic sank, 3 films were produced. The first film featured Titanic and was released immediately following the disaster and was mostly a bogus 10-minute newsreel circulated in movie theaters. Much of the footage is of Titanic's sister ship Olympic, which having been completed a year earlier had much more extensive photographic coverage. Unsophisticated movie audiences of the time were easily taken in by these deceptions. Sales company Animated Weekly released a primitive animated reconstruction of the disaster to satisfy movie audiences' hunger for any kind of footage related to Titanic. It was common practice in this period to produce animated versions of news events that did not enjoy the benefit of coverage by real movie cameras. A similar animated version of the sinking of the Lusitania was produced 3 years later and still exists. The third was the first motion picture when the medium was still in its infancy. There were a handful of individuals connected with the film industry aboard the Titanic. Most did not survive. One who did was Dorothy Gibson, a part-time actress who was also a first-class passenger. Within weeks of her rescue, her studio, a Claire film company, capitalized on the connection by releasing a 10-minute feature, Saved from the Titanic. In the film, Miss Gibson wore the same dress in which she had boarded a Titanic lifeboat. Where she was actually one of the first in the lifeboat, in the film the heroine helps rescue several people and is one of the last to enter the boat. The film no longer exists, and there were undoubtedly several other silent film versions of the Titanic disaster which did not survive. It is estimated that almost 90% of the films made during the silent era are forever lost. An early German film about the disaster was assumed lost, but was rediscovered weeks after the release of the Cameron film. In 1929, British International Pictures released Atlantic in both silent and sound versions. The film was a then rare example of what today has become a television staple, for international co-production with talking versions in English, French, and German. For many European audiences, this was the first all-talking film they had seen. The film was based on a play called The Berg. The shots of the lifeboats being lowered down the side of the ship was filmed on a real liner docked on the River Thames. The title Atlantic is also the name of the ship, as the film's producers were threatened by lawsuit from the White Star Line, one of the many attempts by the ship's company to discourage filmmakers from dramatizing the Titanic disaster. In 1933, the Fox production Cavalcade, based on a play by Noel Coward, featured a scene where a doomed honeymoon couple were discussing their plans for the future on the deck of an unidentified ship. As they moved away from the railing, we see the name Titanic printed on the life ring. The film won an Academy Award as Best Picture of 1933. In 1937, a romantic comedy drama called History is Made at Night, where the climax of the film takes place on board a new luxury liner that collides with an iceberg in the North Atlantic, after the captain is instructed by the owner to ignore ice warnings and race for a record crossing. The difference between this movie and the actual event is that after the collision, the ship's bulk holds hold, the liner is saved, and the passengers, who were earlier lowered in lifeboats, are able to get back on board. In 1943, during the Second World War, the German film industry, under very strict control of the Nazis, made a propaganda version of the disaster called Titanic. It was one of the most expensive German films made up until that time. By then, the war had turned against the Third Reich, and average Germans were experiencing shortages in food, gasoline, and other resources. The film was a pet project of Hitler and the confident and powerful Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. The fact that the real disaster highlighted British incompetence and corruption appealed to Goebbels, and there was considerable opportunity for dramatic license. Titanic was a flop when it released. Regular bombing raids on German cities by the combined American and British air forces did not whet the public's appetite for a disaster movie. The Nazi censors yanked it from circulation, were still far too sympathetic towards the British passengers despite the obvious propaganda. The film was confiscated by the occupying American Army in 1945, and attempts in 1950 to revive the theatrical release of the film in Germany failed, as the film was still deemed by authorities to be too anti-British. In another stroke of irony, Titanic was shown in East Germany during the 1950s, as the film's anti-British bias suited communist ideology better than it had the Nazis. 1953. 20th Century Fox decided the Titanic story deserved the full Hollywood treatment. Titanic was a lavish docudrama with mixed fictional and real characters, and opened in Hollywood on April 14th, exactly 41 years after the disaster. The film starred Barbara Stanwyck, Clifton Webb, and Robert Wagner. In this movie, some of the characters sang "Nearer, My God, to Thee," and that one scene has since become a permanent part of Titanic mythology. In 1955, Walter Lord wrote a book called A Night to Remember, and in 1958, due to the enormous popularity of Lord's book, Irish film producer William McQuitty, who had witnessed the launch of Titanic in Belfast in 1911, decided the story deserved a lavish big screen treatment. Up to 1957, A Night to Remember is without question the best and most authentic of all the Titanic movies previously produced. The obsession for authentic detail stands up to repeated viewings. Only minor alterations were made to the historic record for dramatic purposes, particularly the use of composite fictional characters who embodied the characteristics of several real people representing the three classes on board the ship. The gut-wrenching sequences portraying the alleged stupidity of the California officers while the Titanic is sinking have probably done more to stir up sympathy for the much-aligned Captain Stanley Lord than any other single factor. Despite unanimous positive reviews and a slew of various film award nominations, A Night to Remember did a mediocre business at the box office when it was released. Perhaps the movie's strengths as a docudrama and McQuitty's refusal to make token dramatic concessions weakened its box office appeal. In 1964, the life of the colorful, real-life Titanic survivor, Mrs. J.J. Brown, was turned into a Broadway musical, The Unsinkable Molly Brown. The film adaptation starred Debbie Reynolds in the title role. Maggie was a backwoods orphan who became one of the wealthiest women in Denver, Colorado, when her husband struck it rich by discovering a silver mine. Considered a rube and snubbed by Denver society, Maggie frequently traveled to Europe and became a favorite of the titled international set. While returning to America on Titanic, Maggie ended up in lifeboat number 6, where she took charge when the assigned crew member proved unequal to the test. Brown's exploits on Titanic were well publicized, and she finally found social acceptance from those who had snubbed her. Hollywood could never ignore such an interesting and colorful personality, and practically every Titanic movie features this character in a supporting role. In 1979, ABC Sunday Night Movie presented SOS Titanic, a lavish made-for-TV movie. In 1980, the movie Raise the Titanic, based on a novel by Clive Cussler that had enjoyed the bestseller status a few years earlier. In 1981, Time Bandits, a fantasy adventure produced by ex-Beatle George Harrison, where a collection of dwarves who travel in time end up on the deck of Titanic just before the collision. In 1989, in a brief sequence of Ghostbusters 2, a ghostly apparition of Titanic arrives in New York, and long-dead passengers are seen disembarking. In 1996, Titanic was an integral part of the theme in a TV movie based on Daniel Steele's No Greater Love. In 1996, there was a TV bomb called Titanic. The CBS movie was clearly designed to exploit the hype swirling around the then uncompleted Cameron film. In 1997, the James Cameron blockbuster was released, a story of Rose, a 100-year-old woman who shares her experience on Titanic. The movie was the highest grossing film until the release of Avatar and still ranks number 2. Since this release, we have seen Titanic featured in other movies, including La Camarera del, The Legend of Titanic, Britannic, Titanic, The Legend Goes On, Ghosts of the Abyss, In Search of Titanic, Shark Tale, Titanic 2. And still to come is Titanic, Blood and Steel, a forthcoming 12-part BBC television drama series partially filmed in Ireland about the construction and sinking of the Titanic. It is one of 2 large-budget television dramas due to be aired in April 2012, the anniversary of the disaster. The other? Titanic. Also look for the re-release of James Cameron's 1997 Titanic in 3D. Well, this has been a look at a few of the at least 27 movies and films that have featured Titanic. And don't be surprised if there are more coming to a screen near you. To say that Titanic still holds a fascination with us is a bit of an understatement. Well, for more information about Ireland, the birthplace of Titanic, visit us at www.rhapsodytours.net. That's Rhapsody, R-H-A-P-S-O-D-Y, tours.net, or on Facebook at Ireland, the Birthplace of Titanic page, or on Twitter at Rhapsody Tours. On the next video, we'll take a look at finding the Titanic. Until then, have a wonderful day.